Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is the Libertarian Angle. I'm joined by Sheldon Richman, the foundation's vice president. As you know, this is a show that brings you the libertarian angle on the burning issues of the day. Sheldon, I thought we would go back and discuss in more depth something that we started to discuss last week in the context of foreign policy, and that is that this TGIF article that you wrote a couple of weeks ago now on foreign policy, and specifically focusing in on an academic paper published by the Independent Institute that was authored by Chris Coyne and Abigail Hall. The thesis being that that there really isn't a separation of domestic policy and foreign policy when it comes to interventionism, and that in fact when the U.S. government intervenes in foreign affairs with military invasions, occupations, and so forth, it has this boomerang effect on domestic policy. So why don't you go ahead and explain a little bit more about what your paper was about and what Abigail Hall and Chris Coyne were saying there.
Yeah, it's in the Independent Review. It's very readable. It's accessible. It's online. So no one should be scared off by the fact that you described it as an academic paper. There are footnotes, but it's a very readable paper, as the Independent Review always is. So their thesis is that, as you put it, they call it the boomerang effect. In other words, we know what happens with a boomerang. If you're throwing it correctly, it comes back to you. So here the point is that illiberal, unlibertarian policies that are enacted in the developing world by, or any foreign country actually, by a power like the United States, will eventually find their way back home and create illiberal policies, unlibertarian policies for the American people. There's a tendency to think that the two can be kept separate, that foreign policy need not influence domestic policy. In fact, Coyne and Hall don't make this connection, but in the recent article by Dan McCarthy, the editor of the American Conservative, where he argued that liberalism, and by that he means generally, limited government and economic freedom and domestic freedom, he made the argument that liberalism needs empire to keep the world safe and the trade open, and he actually made the argument that it helps liberalize domestic policy. It induces the policies that bring more freedom domestically. So he's making the opposite point. So the Coyne-Hall paper in some ways refutes McCarthy, even though they don't mention the McCarthy papers, probably written before McCarthy's article came out. They argue that it brings anti-freedom policies to the United States. And the way it does it through 4 different channels, which it discusses in detail. I won't go into all the details, but generally the idea is that even in a country that begins predisposed to liberty, individual liberty at home, and would not like surveillance by the government, would not like muscular, militarized police departments watching the people and using excessive force, even a people that start against, feeling against those things, which you could say a lot of Americans, have been. If the government can use the same kind of those tactics overseas when they occupy a country, and they may occupy a foreign country for good sounding reasons, just the way the invasion of Iraq was presented to the American people as something necessary, not only for American security, but they also argued it was to bring freedom to the Iraqi people. So they put this positive spin on it. But once there, of course, the military administration and the civilian administration, there was some combination there of American civilians and military, they enacted policies that we would never have tolerated at home, right? There was domestic spying, surveillance, very rough tactics, torture, rounding up people, things that, we would be resistant to. And yet, once it's done there, it does further the skills of people who are good at those kinds of jobs, those kinds of duties. And also it helped develop the technologies necessary for that, for surveillance, et cetera. And then those things eventually come home because you have people coming home with those skills, and you have all this equipment now that's been developed by military contractors, government contractors, and it finds a way then into domestic policy, and they trace the NSA surveillance back to the American government's operation in the Philippines at the turn of the 20th century after the Spanish-American War, when the U.S. came to possess the Philippines, and there was an uprising against this foreign rule, foreign intervention by the Americans, and it was brutally put down by the U.S. And so they traced the surveillance to that, and the militarization of police they actually trace back to World War II and Vietnam. So they show the interaction, or particularly the one-way direction of foreign policy into our domestic policy.
Well, and when you look at places like Iraq, where the U.S. government attacks a country whose government has never attacked the United States, never even threatened to attack the United States, they go in there with this brutal invasion, brutal occupation, and they say, This is going to be the model society. We're going to liberate, after they didn't find the WMDs that they used as the excuse for invading. They said, well, while we're here, we're not going to apologize. We're not going to go home because we didn't find the WMDs. Now that we're here, we're going to shift gears, and now we're going to do this for the Iraqi people. And we're going to bring a free society. And they honestly believe that this is a free society. Many of them still do. I've seen conservatives talk about that we liberated Iraq and so forth. And they were very proud of what they had accomplished in Iraq. Well, I was sitting there saying, if they call this freedom, this is a very ominous sign, because heaven forbid that they should ever import that freedom to the United States. I mean, if you look at what's one of the fascinating phenomena about the U.S. Military and the CIA is that when they go into these countries, the last thing they want to establish when they're rebuilding the nation is to rebuild a nation on the principles on which America was founded. I mean, you recall when they set up their prisoner camp at Guantanamo Bay, they specifically said this is going to be a constitution-free zone. We don't have to answer to judges. We can do it our way. And that's their rationale in Iraq. There's no constitution applicability in Iraq, so we can do whatever we want. Well, look at what the kind of society they established. They immediately, put in a system of gun control. They are rounding up people. The Iraqi regime rounds up people, including dissidents. There's indefinite detention. There's assassination. There's torture. All the things that the framers understood and our ancestors were concerned about that our government would do in the absence of the Bill of Rights that expressly prohibits these things. So, yeah, it does concern me that that's the way they operate. That's the way they believe in operating when they're in overseas countries. Why wouldn't they translate that mindset over here? And to me, it's more than just the technological skills. It's they actually look for opportunities to keep us safe from the enemies that their policies are producing overseas. Because if you look at the surveillance scheme, what's the justification for this massive super secret surveillance? To keep us safe. Now we all know that's nonsense, because they're spying on everyone. We know what government does with information like that. Engages in blackmail and extortion, make sure politicians go their way, keep dissent low in society, or otherwise we'll disclose this secret information that we have about your personal life that we acquired through surveillance. But look at the other things, the power to assassinate Americans with no trial, no due process, the power to torture Americans and hold them in military custody. That was what the Jose Padilla case was all about. So, yeah, to me, this thing is integral. It's integrated. That the foreign policies of empire, invasion, occupation, regime change, coups, they cannot help but have an effect over here on our freedom here at home.
Yeah, I don't think anybody would say that the former prime minister of Iraq, Maliki, was presiding over a free system. What the Hawks say is that if Obama had not pulled out prematurely in 2011, prematurely in their view, that the U.S. presence could have pushed Maliki, more and more in a pro-freedom direction, including Sunnis and Kurds in the government, contrary to what he did, which was run a highly sectarian regime, keeping anybody but Shia out of the army, out of the civil service, and things of that nature. So I don't know that anybody today is claiming Iraq is free thanks to the U.S. government's conduct there. They claim blunders by Obama primarily. The Republicans will blame Obama, of course, for leaving Maliki there alone to do what he wants to do. Of course, he's an ally of Iran, so they can blame Iran at the same time for all that. But no, that's true. The feedback, and this, as I said in my article, which summarized the Coin Hall paper, that what they describe is the process warned of by Chalmers Johnson, who is the late Chalmers Johnson, who was an analyst of the American empire, who said that if you don't dismantle the empire, you will end up living under it. So they are confirming, his judgment about that in very good detail. I really recommend the paper to people.
Yeah, what I was referring to is in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, where they knocked out Saddam, and that for several years after that, conservatives were saying what a great thing this was. They were praising the troops, thanking the troops for their service, because they had brought freedom to the Iraqi people. They had saved them from Saddam Hussein. And they kept saying, oh, isn't the world better off without Saddam? Aren't the Iraqi people better off? And I kept saying that, hey, this isn't a cost-benefit analysis. They're killing an unlimited number of Iraqis in order to supposedly bring this nice, beautiful paradise to the survivors. And, of course, I always questioned whether it was a nice society at any time during that process. But for many years there, the conservatives were celebrating how much better off the Iraqi people were in terms of freedom and better society and without Saddam. But back to the original point, I think this is one of the central messages that John Quincy Adams was saying, what Chris Coyne and Abigail Hall have written about in this paper. And by the way, anybody that wants to access that can come to our website and look under the articles, the main articles, and look for Sheldon's TGIF from a couple of weeks ago, and it links to this article from the Independent Institute. But John Quincy Adams, in this great speech, if people haven't read that, I highly recommend it. You can Google it. All you got to do is in search of monsters to destroy. Just put that in Google, and it'll pop up. And it's a beautiful speech. And what John Quincy Adams is saying is, look, this is not what America was built on. And this is 1821 when he's giving a 4th of July, a patriotic speech to Congress. He's saying what America stands for and what it was founded on was the principles that the government, the federal government, would not have the authority, moral or legal or constitutional, to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. I mean, there's lots of monsters in the world. There's dictators, there's famines, there's starvation, there's civil wars, there's wars between nations. But the U.S. government would not be charged with the task, and was not charged with the task in the Constitution, of going abroad to help people out suffering these horrible things. Instead, our job here in America would be to establish a free society as a model for the world. There was also open immigration, the idea that if people were suffering tyranny and oppression or starvation, they would know that if they could get away, there was always at least one place in the world that they could go without getting turned back. And so then John Quincy Adams says, if America ever changes the direction on which it was founded, where the government's now going abroad in search of these monsters to destroy, that it's going to fundamentally alter America itself. That he said that America would become the dictatress of the world. And it seems to me, Sheldon, that that's exactly what's been proven to be the case. That in this whole concept of foreign interventionism, it has fundamentally changed our society. I mean, for our government to lead the world in assassinations every week, it is just incredible. I mean, really, America is an assassination nation now. To me, it's so shocking, but yet it's becoming an everyday part of the U.S. government. It's kind of like accepted that they out assassinating people in Yemen or Pakistan or whatever. And the government invades countries where it wants to just affect a regime change, sanctions, embargoes. And it has done something to our character here at home. I mean, how could it not have an effect when your government is out just killing people every week? Through assassination, occupations, or whatever, it's inevitably going to have an effect on the character of the American people, and that's what John Quincy Adams was saying.
Well, I think we could point out that the politicians learned from Quincy Adams' speech, because they rarely defend an intervention, a foreign intervention, on the grounds that it's a monster to be destroyed, purely as a sort of humanitarian act. That's happened recently, but I don't think that's the primary defense. The primary defense, they'll say, and we can see it in the case of ISIS, is that it's self-defense. In other words, we're not just going to slay a monster because there's a monster out there roaming the world. It's dangerous to us. And of course, they've changed the definition to imminent so they can say it's an imminent danger to us. Imminent now means not imminent, but it includes both imminent and non-imminent. So they're not saying we just need to go and kill monsters. We need to go kill monsters that threaten us. So notice when Quincy Adams made his speech, he was responding, if you read the beginning of the speech, he's responding to people outside of the country who were saying, in effect, they were saying, well, what's America done for us? Okay, you've had your experiment so many years, 20, 40 years in whatever it was in your self-government, democracy. What good has it been to the rest of the world? And he was responding, well, our job's not to go out and correct the rest of the world. So that's a good answer. But the politicians learned that won't sell with the American people. Notice like you said, they didn't say we have to go to Iraq because people will be freer if we get rid of Saddam Hussein. That came afterwards, after they were already there. They said he's a threat to us because of the weapons of mass destruction, which they then couldn't find, so they had to run around and find something else to say. Even with the Spanish-American War, it was Remember the Maine. An American ship exploded in the harbor, right, at Cuba, and they were obviously alleging sabotage by the Spanish. Apparently, it was nothing but a boiler exploding. I guess that's been established. I'm not sure of the state of the scholarship on the Maine recently, but that was the battle cry. Remember the Maine. In other words, they attacked us. They didn't attack the landmass, but they attacked the American ship, just like ISIS is now beheaded to Americans. So they don't simply say we have to go slay monsters wherever they are. Their implication is only when they're a danger to us. Of course, it's very easy for them to make a case to the American people that somebody out there is a danger to us, because you just say it's a potential danger, or like I said, you redefine the word imminent. So that's what they do, and so far it's been successful because they're obviously stepping up the bombing and even the introduction of troops, U.S. troops into Syria. Well, not into bombing in Syria, but troops in Iraq.
I agree with you. I mean, that's the original justification for attacking somebody, that they're about to attack you or that they have attacked you. I mean, that was the whole idea that Roosevelt was trying to pull off in World War II. He knew that the American people and the Congress were opposed to entry into another European war. They had seen what had happened in World War I, total waste of American life. They were overwhelmingly opposed, and so he wouldn't go to Congress and say, hey, let me give you the reasons as to why we need to intervene in this. We need to save the world from Hitler. Instead, he figured out ways to get attacked. He was provoking the Germans in the Atlantic. I don't think anybody denies that. Military convoys going into a war zone and furnishing of weaponry to one side. And then when that didn't work and the Germans didn't take the bait, and he goes over into the Pacific, he starts provoking the Japanese. He was expecting an attack by the Japanese somewhere. And so he could say, hey, we've been attacked. Now we have no choice, but we have to fight back. In the Spanish-American War, they come up with this ridiculous excuse, remember the Maine, but that doesn't really explain why they felt they needed to establish this brutal rule over the Philippines. I mean, the Spanish Empire was already finished, and certainly the Philippines didn't pose any threat to the United States. It was about empire, hegemony. And I think that's what we need to keep focusing people's attention on, that ISIS doesn't have the military means to attack, invade, and conquer the United States. I mean, that's even just a ridiculous notion. No nation state's got that military capability. You need hundreds of thousands of transport planes, millions of troops. hundreds of thousands of ships, materiel, trillions of dollars of money. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is at most a civil war or an interregional conflict. But really what it's all about is they propped up this regime in Iraq. They have a vested interest because they think that the Iraqi regime is one of their puppet regimes, which is questionable given its loyalty to Iran. And so they're going back in there, I think, to slay this monster, to establish, their hegemony in the Middle East. But I think we ought to be attacking at both sides. That it's the empire that produces, and it's with its interventionism, the very threats that it then uses to take away our freedoms at home. And that the only real solution to this entire mess is to dismantle this apparatus, stop the interventionism, limit the government to defending the United States over here. Let's see if anybody comes with those transport ships and planes and millions of troops. It's ridiculous. They should have dismantled this thing at the end of the Cold War. That was the original justification, and it should have gone out of existence in 1989, if not before.
Well, with the possible exception of Lindsey Graham in the Senate, who says, look, they're going to come over here and kill us all. I don't think anyone is predicting or fearing that ISIS is going to get on ships or planes and mount an invasion of the United States. That's not what's being warned about, obviously. They warn about terrorism, right? Sending people over here, some of whom may hold American passports, to cause mischief, to blow something up. But, of course, they don't need to send anybody over because the other big fear, apparently a bigger fear of the U.S. government, are lone wolves and people who are already here, who, as they put it, self-radicalize, like the Tsarnaev brothers in the Boston Marathon. You can be reading websites or just reading the news and seeing what the U.S. is doing over there and become angry and say, darn it, I'm going to blow up, blow something up. The guy that shot up Fort Hood, he wasn't over there. They didn't send him over here. So there's no need to go fight ISIS if your fear is that there could be terrorism in the United States. That would seem to me just require normal police work. And people don't need to be coming over by plane, by boat, by sneaking over borders to do that. I mean, people are already here who will be motivated by it. But what motivates people to do it is the very foreign policy that we're talking about today, as you just pointed out. I mean, if you really wanted to scare, I read in the paper over the weekend that the U.S. government's starting some sort of project to try to discourage young people in the United States, and I guess primarily Muslims, you would think, from being lured by ISIS. Well, they might as well save their money. They don't need to have a program. Stop the bombing and the aiding of other people who are killing them. Get out of the Middle East. That would be the best program to tell young Americans Muslim belief, or just who have a sense of adventure and want to get into something, romantic foreign fight or do something bad here. That's the best way to dissuade people from thinking about that. Stop doing harm to people over there. But no, they have to have, I don't know what it'll cost. They got to have some program that's going to, make an outreach to the Muslim community. And I don't know, what are they going to do? Get young Muslim kids involved in basketball so they won't think about terrorism? It seems much more efficient to just stop the murdering over there, the drones, the cruise missiles, the F-16s and all those things. Stop that. That's the best thing. They don't need government money to learn how to play basketball.
That's really the crux. I mean, you saw that immediately after 9/11, this statement about they came over here because they hate our freedom and values. I mean, the empire, the national security establishment, the military, the CIA, the whole federal apparatus has this vested interest in convincing people that there's just people out there that want to do Americans harm. They want to behead Americans. They don't come out. The federal officials don't come out and say it, but they intimate that these are radical Muslims. It's sort of a religious crusade, and that we have to save America from these religious fanatics. I mean, that's really what we have to continue dealing with head on. And Ron Paul, he's the guy that started this in the political arena when he went in that famous presidential debate and he said what he's not supposed to say in public. He said they all got upset over it because he spoke the truth. He said they came over here because we, the federal government, was over there killing them. And so, they see an American beheaded by this group, and the group makes it very clear. The reason we're doing this to you is because you've just dropped a bunch of bombs on our comrades here and you've killed a bunch of our friends. We are retaliating against you for your bombing campaign. Well, then the interventionists say to themselves, oh my gosh, these are dangerous people. Clearly they would come and behead everybody, so we need to go bomb them some more. Well, the some more then produces another beheading or more terrorist attacks. I mean, I've said that this is the greatest terrorist producing machine in history. It never stops. The more they bomb, the more people they kill, the more retaliation through terrorism. So in a sense, if the empire wants to exist and prosper with ever increasing budgets, why wouldn't they do this, Sheldon? This is the greatest racket in history, where the average American sits there and says, oh, they have to keep bombing because otherwise these people will come and get us, not realizing that it's the bombing itself, the assassinations, the interventions that are producing the anger and hatred that then is then used as the excuse for more bombing and more attacks. And in the meantime, in the process of this entire thing, the government now wields the authority to assassinate Americans, torture Americans, round up Americans. I mean, sure, these powers are not being exercised widely, but the fact that they're even wielded now is an absolute shock. And it goes back to the original theme of this program, that you've got this integration between the interventionism and what's happening here at home. Another point I want to bring up is about the spending and the debt. I mean, we know what that does to a country when you have out of control spending and ever increasing mountains of debt with inflation very likely around the corner, where the government's just debasing the money supply in the hopes of paying off its debt with debased currency. We know what that does to a country. A country starts rotting from within. And the warfare state people blame it on the welfare state people and say, oh, it's just because all those people on welfare. And the welfare state people blame it on the military and their ever-increasing budgets. But really, they're both responsible. But clearly, the national security component of our government is enormously expensive. And let's not forget how they financed their war in Iraq. They went to the Chinese communist regime and borrowed the money there, which means now the American taxpayer is in hock to the Chinese communist regime. How can all this benefit the American people in terms of liberty and prosperity?
Right. It's one thing leads to the next thing. So before you know it, you have this huge out of control machinery. And of course, nobody in Washington shows any signs of even wanting to get a handle on it, much less knowing how to do it. So it's just more of the same. And we've got an election coming up, but nothing's going to change as a result of that. And in 2 years, we have an election coming up, and I don't see anything on the horizon that's going to mean there's any substantive change there. So we're just going to keep on doing what we're doing. Pretty much everybody's a hawk these days in official circles. And the Democrats are likely going to nominate a hawk. And I don't know what the Republicans are going to do, but I seriously doubt if it's going to be a Ron Paul type of person, even if his last name is Paul. I don't hear any kind of clear, systematic presentation of a non-interventionist foreign policy and identifying these very things that you've identified, how it all comes back to haunt us, both in terms of at least the threat of terrorism, but also these other things that Cooley and Hull identify with the feedback, the negative feedback from policy, the boomerang effect. So it's enough to make you a little depressed. So we have to keep talking things up here to keep people's hopes alive, to borrow a phrase from somebody, and not let them get discouraged in the short run. I mean, remember Rothbard always liked to say he was a short-term pessimist but a long-term optimist. So that's I guess the camp I'm in.
Hey, the way I've always felt about it is I'd be depressed if their whole philosophy of interventionism had worked. I think the fact that it doesn't work is causing increasing numbers of people to look at what we libertarians have been saying. And when you look around, sure, on the political scene, Washington, D.C., federal scene, no positive signs there at all. But when you look out here in the hinterlands, There's more and more people than ever before self-identifying as libertarians, especially young people. Not because it's the cool thing to do. It's because they're figuring out that we're right. We're right on the domestic policy. We're right about the empire and foreign policy and the warfare state. That the root cause of these woes that America is suffering is right there in the foreign policy, this huge national security establishment that was brought into existence in the Cold War and should have gone out of existence a long time ago. That's the root of the woes. If Americans want to, there's a way out of this. I mean, that's where I stay optimistic. I mean, I'd be depressed if there was no way out, where we were just trapped in this perpetual system of violence and terrorism and loss of liberty and ever-increasing debt and spending and taxes and inflation. The fact is there's a way out, and I think more and more people are figuring that out, and we just keep plugging away until we reach that critical mass that brings one of those monumental shifts in society that we've read about in history, a shift toward freedom and prosperity, harmony and peace, and that's what libertarianism is all about. Anyway, that's our time. Time's up for the day. That's our Libertarian Angle for this week. Enjoyed visiting with you. I'm Jacob Hornberger with Sheldon Richmond, and we'll see you next time.